the man who climbed to watch. There is a particular kind of longing that has learned to disguise itself as detachment. It is not the longing that presses through crowds or cries out from roadsides or tears open rooftops. It is quieter than that and, in its own way, more complicated. It is the longing of a person who wants something deeply but has constructed around that wanting a set of reasons, intelligent, well-sourced, entirely defensible reasons, for why full participation in the thing they want is not available to them. Not because the desire is gone, but because the history is too tangled, the reputation is too established, the distance between who they are and who they would need to be to walk through the front door is too great and too public and too well known to everyone in the vicinity for the front door to feel like a realistic option. And so they watch. They position themselves at a careful, elevated remove from the thing they most want, and they tell themselves that watching is enough. That proximity without participation is a reasonable substitute for the real thing. That the view from the tree is almost as good as the ground. It is not, but it is safer. And safety, for a person who has been defined by their failures long enough, can start to feel like wisdom. His name was Zacchaeus, and Luke chapter 19 introduces him in 2 sentences that are so compact and so complete in their description of his dilemma that I want to read them slowly. He was a chief tax collector, and he was rich, and he was seeking to see who Jesus was. But on account of the crowd he could not, because he was small in stature. 2 sentences, and already we have everything. The profession that had made him wealthy and made him despised, because tax collectors in first century Jericho were not merely bureaucrats. They were Jews who had sold their cooperation to the Roman occupying power, who collected taxes on behalf of an empire their own people hated, who were permitted by the system to collect above the required amount and keep the surplus for themselves. They were considered traitors. They were excluded from the synagogue. They were placed by the religious establishment in the same moral category as prostitutes and sinners, which is a phrase that appears so consistently in the Gospels that it had clearly become a fixed social label, a category of persons who had put themselves beyond the reach of respectable religious community. Zacchaeus was not merely disliked. He was institutionally, publicly, theologically classified as someone who did not belong in the places where God was present. And he was seeking to see who Jesus was. That sentence is worth everything. He was seeking, present continuous, not a casual glance in the direction of an interesting event passing through town. Seeking, with the specific intentionality of a person who has heard something that has lodged in him in a way that he has not been able to dislodge. Something about this man from Galilee had reached past the walls of Zacchaeus' wealth and his profession and his public disgrace and landed in the part of him that those walls were built to protect, and he wanted to see, not to participate. That was not available to him, given the crowd, given his reputation, given the fact that pressing through a group of people who knew exactly who he was and what he had done would have meant running a gauntlet of contempt that even a man with his resources and his hardened exterior was not prepared to face. But to see, from a distance, from safety, from a perch that gave him the view without the vulnerability. He ran ahead and climbed a sycamore tree, and I want to sit with that image for a long moment. A wealthy man, a powerful man by the standards of his city, a man who had accumulated enough material security to insulate himself from almost everything that the world could throw at him, running, hiking up his robes, moving through the crowd at a pace that was undignified for a man of his position, getting ahead of the procession and finding a tree and climbing it alone, without ceremony, without a crowd of his own, without the apparatus of status that normally accompanied his movements through Jericho. He was in the tree when Jesus arrived, not on the ground with the crowd, above it, separated from it by height and bark and the specific emotional architecture of a person who had decided that watching was the closest he was going to get. The tree was his solution to the problem of wanting something he could not ask for directly. The tree let him want without being seen wanting. It let him be near without being present. It gave him access to the view while protecting him from the cost of being on the ground where Jesus was, where the crowd was, where the people who knew his name and knew what his name meant were standing close enough to make his wanting legible and therefore mockable. From the tree, he could want in private. He could watch this man who was changing everything about the people he encountered. This man who, by all the reports Zacchaeus had heard, sat with tax collectors, and ate with sinners, and did not organize his holiness around the careful maintenance of distance from people like him. And Zacchaeus could watch all of that from a height that kept his own longing invisible. And then Jesus stopped under the tree and looked up. This is the moment that the whole story hinges on, and I want to be very precise about what happened in it, because Jesus did not happen to glance upward and notice Zacchaeus by accident. He stopped. He stopped specifically. He stopped under this particular tree, with this particular man in it, as though the tree had been the destination all along, as though the entire procession through Jericho had been aimed at this sycamore, at this branch, at this specific man who had climbed above the crowd in order to see without being seen, and had inadvertently positioned himself directly in the path of the one set of eyes in that crowd that were not going to let him watch in peace. And he said, "Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today." 3 things in that sentence that I do not want us to move past too quickly. The first is the name. He knew his name, not just his face, not just his location in the tree, not just the general category of his social disgrace. He knew the specific word that meant him. Zacchaeus, in a crowd of people who used that name as shorthand for betrayal and greed and the particular kind of corruption that comes from choosing personal profit over communal loyalty, Jesus said the name not as an accusation but as an address. Not, "You there, chief tax collector, come down." Zacchaeus, the name spoken the way a name is supposed to be spoken, as the word that summons a person into the fullness of who they are, rather than the shorthand that reduces them to what they have done. The second thing is the urgency. Hurry. Not, "When you are ready, when you have processed this, when you have had time to consider whether this is something you want." Hurry. As though the moment was already in motion and Zacchaeus needed to get into it rather than observe it from above. As though the tree was no longer a viable option now that Jesus had stopped beneath it. As though the posture of watching from safety had been rendered obsolete by a single upward glance and a spoken name, and the only remaining question was how quickly Zacchaeus was going to accept the collapse of the distance he had worked so hard to maintain. The third thing is the must. I must stay at your house today. Not, "I would like to if that suits you." Not, "I was thinking perhaps, if you are interested." Must, the word of divine necessity. The word Jesus used when he had to pass through Samaria, when he said there was something on that road that was not optional. Must, I must stay at your house. Which means the dinner was not Zacchaeus' idea. The intimacy was not something he proposed. The table at which his life was going to be reorganized was set not by his initiative, but by the insistence of the one who had looked up into the tree and decided that watching was no longer going to be an option for this man today. Grace does not always wait to be invited. Sometimes it stops under your tree and tells you to hurry down. And he hurried. He came down immediately, the text says, and he received Jesus joyfully. That word, joyfully, is worth holding. Because Zacchaeus was not a man who had been living in joy. He was a man who had traded belonging for comfort, community for currency, the warmth of being part of something for the cold security of having enough to not need to be part of anything. He had made a bargain with the world that had given him everything you can accumulate and taken from him everything you cannot buy. And in the moment of coming down from the tree, in the moment of giving up the watch distance and stepping into the actual presence, something broke open in him that the wealth had never reached. He received Jesus joyfully, not cautiously, not conditionally, not with the measured, calculated, let me see how this goes restraint of a man who has learned to protect himself from disappointment. Joyfully, with the specific, whole-body, undisguised joy of a person who has been seen by someone who should have passed them by, and who did not pass by. And the crowd grumbled. Of course they did. He has gone in to be the guest of a man who is a sinner. The people who had pressed closest to Jesus, who had been on the ground the entire time while Zacchaeus was in the tree, who had traveled with him and witnessed the miracles and received the teaching, they grumbled that the dinner was going to be at the wrong address, that the hospitality was being extended to a man whose house was the least appropriate destination available in Jericho. And there is a painful irony in that grumbling, because the people who grumbled were the people who had blocked the front door by their very presence, who had made the crowd so dense with legitimate seekers that the man in the tree had concluded the ground was not accessible to him. They had not meant to block him, but they had. And now they were grumbling that he had found another way in. Zacchaeus stood and said to the Lord, "Look, half of my goods I give to the poor, and if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I restore it fourfold." Nobody asked him to say that. Jesus did not issue a demand or a condition or a checklist of behavioral changes required before the dinner could proceed. He simply came to the house. He simply sat at the table. He simply brought his presence into the space that Zacchaeus occupied. And the presence did what presence does when it is the presence of the one who made you. It revealed what was wrong by making what was right feel suddenly, urgently possible. The restitution was not the price of the welcome. It was the response to it. The transformation was not the condition of the encounter. It was the fruit of it. Zacchaeus gave away half of what he owned and committed to repay fourfold every fraud, not because Jesus required it before he would love him, but because Jesus had already loved him, had already stopped under the tree and said his name and come to his house. And the love, once received, produced in him a generosity that all the religious pressure in Jericho had never been able to manufacture. You cannot guilt a person into generosity, but you can love them into it. And Jesus said, "Today, salvation has come to this house, since he also is a son of Abraham." Son of Abraham. The phrase that placed Zacchaeus back inside the family he had left. Not, he has now demonstrated sufficient reformation to be considered for reinstatement. Not, his restitution has met the threshold for readmission. Son of Abraham. Present tense. Today, in this house, at this table. In this moment where a man who climbed a tree to watch found himself hosting a dinner he never planned, making promises he never calculated, standing in the full light of a belonging he had decided years ago was not available to him. Now I want to bring this to the place where you actually live, because I think the tree is one of the most universally recognizable postures in this entire collection of gospel stories. The tree is where you go when you want the thing, but cannot bring yourself to ask for it. When the crowd between you and the door is made of your own history, the accumulated record of what you have done and who you have been and what everyone in the vicinity knows about you, and pressing through that crowd feels like a humiliation you cannot afford. When the only way to want without being exposed in the wanting is to get above it, to find a perch that gives you the view while protecting you from the risk. The risk of being seen wanting, the risk of being seen coming, the risk of being on the ground, in the crowd, in the company of people who know exactly what your name means in this town, reaching for something that your history would seem to disqualify you from. You are in the tree, and Jesus is walking through Jericho, and he is going to stop. He is going to stop under the exact tree where you positioned yourself to watch in safety, and he is going to say your name, the one that means you specifically, not the label your failures produced, but the word that was spoken over you before any of the failures accumulated. And he is going to say, hurry, not when you are ready, not after you have processed the theological implications. Hurry, because the moment is already in motion and the distance you maintained is already closed, and the only remaining question is how quickly you are going to come down from the branch and receive what is being offered. And what is being offered is not a conditional probationary welcome. It is dinner, a table, a presence that comes all the way into the house rather than maintaining the respectful distance that your reputation might seem to require. A willingness to be the guest of a person whose address is wrong by every social calculation available. Because Jesus is not governed by social calculation. He is governed by the same thing that made him stop under the tree, the same thing that always makes him stop, which is the sight of someone who is wanting, not performing, not managing, not successfully concealing the want behind the leaves of the tree, wanting, honestly, genuinely, from the gut wanting, the want that sent you ahead of the crowd and up the trunk before you had time to talk yourself out of it. He sees that want. He has always seen it, even from the road, even before he stopped, even when you thought the height was giving you cover. He saw you in the tree and he was already deciding to stop. Come down from the distance that felt like wisdom and turned out to be loneliness. Come down from the branch of watching and step into the ground of participating. Come down from the safe remove of observing what God does in other people's lives, from an altitude that protects your own life from the disruption of actually being encountered. Come down, because the dinner is already being planned and your name is on the invitation, and the host is standing beneath your tree, looking up with the specific patience of someone who has been walking toward this sycamore since before you climbed it. He must stay at your house today, not someone else's house, yours. With its complicated history and its accumulated contents and its rooms that you have not opened to anyone in longer than you want to admit. He must stay there today, not because your house is the most presentable option on the street, but because your house is the one he was walking toward, because your name is the one he stopped to say, because your tree is the one under which salvation decided to pause on its way through Jericho. Today, salvation has come to this house, today. Not after the restitution is complete and the reformation is verified and the record has been sufficiently corrected to warrant the upgrade. Today. Before all of that. In the middle of all of that. As the thing that makes all of that possible, rather than the thing that all of that makes possible. Come down from the tree. The watching is over. The dinner is beginning. Thank you for stopping. For the specific, deliberate, already aimed at this tree stopping that had nothing to do with my making myself visible, and everything to do with your having already seen me before I knew I was being looked for, and for saying my name the way a name is supposed to be said, and for the must that told me the invitation was not optional, not contingent, not a trial offer subject to the crowd's approval, but the insistence of a love that had been walking toward this sycamore since before I climbed it, and for eating at my table, for coming all the way in, for turning the house I had been living in alone into the place where salvation arrived on an ordinary afternoon in Jericho when I thought I was only there to watch.